Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Science Dispatch podcast. This is episode 40. Thank you for joining us as always. My name is Cameron English. I'm your host, joined, as I usually am, by Dr. Chuck Dinerstein, Director of Medicine at the American Council on Science and Health. Chuck, how are you this wonderful day?
I am great. Spring has arrived. The birds knew about it about 2 weeks ago, but the weather is catching up, so I'm a very happy camper today.
It is beautiful outside. I do notice that I sneeze uncontrollably and my throat itches way too much, and it has to be suppressed with a variety of drugs. So I can't say that I'm thrilled that spring is here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But we're going to persist. We're going to make it through. Thank you for holding my hand through this. We're going to get through this. But anyway, two stories to talk about today, as we usually do. The first one is a piece Chuck wrote called ACSH Asks, Where's the Adderall? And then next we've got a story by a contributor, Susan Goldhaber, our resident toxicologist, as I like to call her, called EPA's Scientifically Challenged PFAS Numbers. And obviously I'm biased here, Chuck, but I think these articles illustrate why ACSH plays such an important role in discussions about these different health and science issues, because there's so much confusion here on both of these topics. And I think this really clarifies for people that might be concerned. So let's start with your story on Adderall. And let me just read this quick summary that you put at the top of the story. So you say the shortage of Adderall, an important medication used to treat ADHD, is a story of supply demand, the invisible hand of the market. It's also about a bureaucracy focused on regulation rather than outcome. It has all the hallmarks of the opioid crisis. We have learned nothing. So encouraging start. Let's get into the details. What's going on here?
I really do think there's so many parallels between what's going on with Adderall and the opioid crisis in terms of the various stakeholders and players that it was remarkable enough that I had to write about it. So let's talk about this first with demand. Adderall is an amphetamine, and therefore it is classified as a Schedule II drug, meaning that it is very addictive and it is very likely to be diverted for other uses. So the reason it gets diverted is because this class of drugs, and Adderall is just a brand name for one of them, helps people with ADHD focus. And people that see this mistake their increased focus for a performance enhancer. So there's a lot of students that haven't bothered studying for the year or haven't bothered starting that paper that's due tomorrow that find that these drugs get them through because it keeps them up all night wired up so they can get their work done. So that's why it's classified as a Schedule II drug. So now let's talk about demand in a different way. The diagnosis of ADHD there is no pathognomonic marker that says this person has it, this person does not. One, it's a disease on a spectrum, but more importantly, it's a disease that has a cluster of symptoms, and there has to be some judgment made as to whether these symptoms are significant enough to require medication. And the key in determining whether it's clinically significant is the degree to which the ADHD impairs the person's ability to function, not just at home, not just at school, but in a combination of sites. So it's not the easiest diagnosis to make. And in the article, I cite an article where they looked at pediatricians, and only about 70% of the pediatricians who are seeing patients in the office on a long-term basis were able to follow the clinical guidelines to make a diagnosis of ADHD. Now let's fast forward to 2021, 2022, and we're in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and we see the rise of telemedicine. And telemedicine offered the opportunity for many people that did not have it previously to be seen, air quotes, diagnosed with ADHD and get prescriptions for Adderall. There is no paper out or evidence to say whether these telemedicine physicians did a better job than those pediatricians who are seeing people in the office. But it's at least safe to say that they miss the diagnosis in 30%. There's other articles that suggest that there's been pressure put on these employees of these telemedicine portals to push medication. So you have to kind of look at it from both directions. Adderall and the other amphetamine equivalents are used in the overwhelming number of cases of ADHD, 95, 96% of the time. So what happened is that the demand for Adderall went up significantly by about 40%. That's a big change over the course of a year. And that brings us to the next problem, which is supply. Because it is a Schedule II drug, because it can be diverted, the approach by the DEA has been to limit the quantities of that drug available. And so they get together once a year and they look at how much of the drug was used in the last year and come up with manufacturing capacity limits on how much of the drug can be produced. The difficulty, of course, is that when you have such a dramatic rise of 40% in prescriptions, your predictions about what you need that year are gone. But because the DEA is insisting that those manufacturing caps be kept in place, now all of a sudden there is a supply problem because there's a far greater number of people looking for this drug with a prescription than had been available before. That, of course, brings us to the last of the players in this story, the big three, Cardinal Health, McKesson, and AmerisourceBergen. And as I wrote in the article, if those names are vaguely familiar, it's because those are the distributors of opioids that had to pay money to the state for their negligence. The opioids, again, a Schedule II drug, again controlled by the DEA in terms of manufacture, have regulations about how much of these drugs can go to any pharmacy at any given time. And throughout the opioid crisis, all three of these large distributors ignored those guidelines. Even though their computers are designed to identify them, they just ignore them. That's why you saw, towns of 1,000 people getting enough medicine for 30,000 people. So once the opioid settlement was made, the top three distributors had seen Jesus, I guess, and now knew that they had to really be more strict in what they did. And so when the algorithms flagged a pharmacy for increased prescriptions, which in this case are due increased demand, the law requires them to do their due diligence and find out what's going on at the pharmacy level and make a decision about whether they can increase their supply or not. These companies are, as I described them, too big to know. They don't have any interest in these small retail pharmacies where these problems are occurring, so they just cut them off. And once you cut them off, that does not make the problem go away. As an article in Health Affairs indicated, once you cut people off, they look for a different market. And the market they find is the black market. And while Adderall is easily made, there's more than enough fentanyl to be put in a tablet. And there is no brand certification on black market drugs. So that's the tale.
Yeah, this is such a mess, Chuck. It seems to me to illustrate so many problems that are endemic in our healthcare system. And the overarching issue, and tell me what you think about this, seems to be that everyone responsible for making decisions, for prescribing the drugs, for regulating the drugs, for producing them, they all have conflicting incentives, and none of them seem to be aligned with what the patients need. Like the kids who need these drugs to get through their school day, or people who need these to hold down a job and keep themselves level and so forth. So as a physician, give me your insight on that. Do you agree with that assessment, first of all?
I certainly agree that these drugs make it possible for people with ADHD to be far more functional in society than without them. So, they have the stories that you can find on social media about losing jobs because you can't get the drugs, having problems in school. I mentioned some of that when I wrote. But I think the bigger problem that I see is that we develop these regulations with the best of intents, but nobody carries them out in an appropriate manner. There's nothing wrong with a red flag warning to say to a pharmacy, hey, you're prescribing 3 times more Adderall than before. What's going on? But that requires somebody to make a phone call, talk to them, find out what's going on locally, maybe check the prescriptions from the doctors and see what's going on and say, okay, we're good. But more and more, these large companies that are driven by algorithms, and our government is driven by algorithms too. Let's not, leave them out of the mix. Rely on the algorithms to do the actual work rather than to do the due diligence themselves, which, takes time. I think you see the same thing in a lot of our public health dilemmas. It's no different than the early days when they were doing COVID vaccines, and they rolled out these computer platforms that didn't work, that crashed, that people spent days, trying to get on so they could get in for their first dose of vaccine. They're very good at making rules. They're very good at making programs, and they are very, very poor at carrying them out.
So it seems to me, and I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. You tell me. The system is just too big. It seems to me there are not many, but there's a handful of really big companies that are doing most of this business, most of this prescription drug business. Then you have regulators that have to oversee all this. And again, their incentives tend to be, I don't want to get in trouble for people dying. So they tend, and this will carry over into our next story too, they tend to employ an excess of caution. And then this changes how the companies behave, in that they're just, as you said, they're just going to cut off small pharmacies, and there's little verification going on. So I don't know if there's an answer, as with so many things we talk about. It seems to me that segmenting how this industry operates and how regulators operate would help. If you had a smaller group of people responsible for a smaller demographic or a state, or I don't know how you would divide it. But what do you think of that? Just out of condensing the system.
I think it would be nice if people would just do their job. I know that makes me old. I mean, I'm an old person. I accept that fact. But a lot of this just has to do with what I would call laziness in actually doing the job that you have. It's red flag warnings, and this cuts across all the red flag warnings, are meant to heighten your attention to a problem, not simply make a cut and dry decision that the computer can do. And you are right. These companies that are too big to know are also just too big. They form what's called an oligopoly, which is a variation on monopoly. Monopoly consists of one company, but we're on to that trick, so we don't allow that. But we have a lot of oligopolies in the country. Basically, a monopolistic system that involves 3 or 4 or 5 firms. Telephones, mobile phones is an oligopoly. Distribution of medications is an oligopoly. Those 3 companies control 90% of the health supplies going throughout the country. They can charge whatever they want. They can do whatever they want. And at that market size, it is very difficult for a startup to come and be disruptive. A small firm that could come in and know the region and supply medications to the region, that could do its due diligence because they already know the people, that can't exist because these other companies wipe them away because they can save somebody a penny or 2 pennies on the dollar.
This is crazy stuff. And later on in the story, you talk about the prohibition angle and how this contributes. And you mentioned this earlier, but I don't think, at least I don't think many people know this. that the production caps are set by the federal government, and I mean, to me, that seems crazy, right? Because when it comes to medication, it seems that there should be sort of a natural ebb and flow and how much is produced and how much is prescribed. But when you have a bureaucracy, like I believe it's the DEA that sets the production cap, you're already removed, as we were talking about a minute ago, right? The DEA has different incentives than a healthcare provider does, or an individual physician or whatever,
or even a manufacturer, because they just have to go along with it. And there's lots of ways to control how much of this drug comes into the system. One way to control it, of course, is just to have the manufacturer have a buffer available of the drug and keep it under lock and key. But they're a little disinclined to do that. That's where this push for just-in-time manufacturing and just-in-time this or that lean production systems comes to be, because there is a cost of warehousing things. So they need to warehouse a buffer supply. They don't want to overbuild that particular warehouse. Or the distributors could warehouse the drugs. But again, they're not interested in doing that either. Those are all simple things you can do to take out the highs and lows, flow. I was particularly struck by the fact that the New York Times, which is not an anti-regulation newspaper, said very clearly that the DEA has had 5 years to show that they could do this better than the FDA and can't. Enough is enough. Just the thought that once a year you sit down and look at the prescriptions being done and come up with production quotas is on its face insanity. Now, there may be issues at the manufacturing level that I don't understand in terms of how they have to set up their manufacturing facilities to turn out the drug, because there's some costs involved in switching machinery and cleaning up the plant and this and that, so that they may not be able to run all year round. But certainly you can come up with a way to update your needs more than once a year, every quarter, every 2 or 3 months. But that's a conversation between the manufacturers and the regulators. But we just don't do that. We just, I guess, that saying that has been going around of, stay in your own lane. Sometimes you need to get a little closer to the edge of the next lane so you can talk to the guy there.
Or at least use your blinker, right?
Use your blinker. And maybe, the lanes are a little unclear and you can both share a little bit. Maybe it's more of a country road than a super highway.
There you go. Here's the direct quote from the Times so people get this. And I was struck by this too, because it's just so matter of fact and correct, which is not common for the Times. So they write, I believe this was an editorial, but they write,
Yeah.
the DEA has had 5 decades to prove that it can do better than the FDA in controlling potentially dangerous drugs used in medicine. It has failed. It's beautiful. I don't think anyone could have said it better. But before we move on to the next story, Chuck, we've talked about the supply side. Is there anything that could be done on the demand side, whether it's, I don't know, better educating physicians about this issue, or making sure that these telehealth companies are actually diagnosing patients before they prescribe these drugs? I mean, anything on that side that you could do to...
I think I think that the physicians that are prescribing these drugs, which are in large part mental health professionals, pediatricians, pretty well know the guidelines. I think that it would be worthwhile to look at the telemedicine's health records. How that gets done will be an interesting question, because I suspect that a lot of those health records are tied to commercial insurers. So it's nothing that the government can say, we need the records. It could come from the insurance companies. But I think that if telemedicine is to play a valid role in our health system, and it certainly has shown itself to increase the access for people that need care, then they also should be required to demonstrate the quality of their work, just as is required of all health systems and physicians.
Yeah, well, I just don't know how that gets done. I guess we'll have to muse on this some more. I wonder as well if the next, hopefully we don't have another pandemic in the near future, but maybe the next time there's a society altering crisis, we could think a little bit further ahead about the long-term consequences of the policies. So I don't want to get into the lockdown debate right now,
No.
but perhaps something could be done to say, okay, let's think about how changing how millions of students learn for the better part of a year is going to impact demand for drugs and demand for different services and so forth. It seems like that would help because from reading your article, the impression I get is that there was this sudden change, which very likely spiked the demand for Adderall and some of the equivalent drugs. Is that right?
That's 100% correct, and we can argue back and forth about whether that is necessarily foreseeable. But even in real time, as you start to see those numbers rise, you would expect somebody to say, hey, wait a minute, this is not what the model said was going to happen. Why don't we look at what's going on? But they don't, because they're so busy doing whatever they do, which is nothing.
Check Dinerstein with the helpful summaries. All right. So there you go. Another serious problem no one has an answer for. At least you're aware of it now. Okay. All right. So now let's move on. This is a similar cluster F of a situation, I think, but unrelated to drugs. So this is Susan Goldhaber. She's talking about the EPA's scientifically challenged standards for these so-called forever chemicals, PFAS and PFOS. So what's going on here, Chuck? What is the EPA? She is not, by the way, Susan is not very friendly with the EPA on this issue. So what's her complaint here?
She feels that the decisions made by the EPA with respect to the forever chemicals is based on, let's call it, uncertain science. I think we're safer there. She begins talking about the process by which standards are set, and she talks first about the proposed standard for these forever chemicals in our drinking water. In our drinking water, the EPA has proposed an amount of 4 parts per trillion, which is not measurable by any instrumentation we have. So in essence, the water companies will have to do a test, and it has to say there are no detectable levels. That will be the new standard, and of course that's going to cost money to get that done. Now, the reason for setting a standard at all is because of health concerns with the forever chemicals, and for that she briefly references an article which was used to develop the standard to begin with. And that is a study of 650 children born on the Faroe Islands between 1997 and 2000. And what they did was they measured the blood levels of these forever chemicals in the children and the mothers. They measured the mothers at about 8 months of pregnancy and the kids at about the age of 5, as well as the age of 7. And what they found is that the children that had gotten their booster shots for diphtheria and tetanus showed less of a response to those antigens at age 7 than initially, especially in the group of children that had higher levels of these forever chemicals. So on the basis of that, they said these chemicals cause changes in our immune system, and therefore we must put a limit upon them. So we can argue back and forth about whether a study of 600 children on the Faroe Islands is a representative sample of what might be found in the United States. We can argue that a slight change in their antibody titers to diphtheria and tetanus is of no surprise, since both of these vaccines have half-lives. But then the EPA took it one step further and said that from other studies, of one study, in fact, of individuals with renal cell carcinoma, cancer of the kidney, that there were elevated PFOS and PFOA levels, and therefore this drug was carcinogenic. And the EPA treats carcinogens differently than it treats other harmful chemicals. There is a zero tolerance for any carcinogen in our food or water supply, which, I think makes sense at one level, but at a purely objective scientific level, doesn't necessarily hold water, because biologic systems often have thresholds before they respond. So there very well may be a threshold of a forever chemical that we can tolerate, not causing any problems at all. And Susan's concern is that the EPA ignored that question completely and said that as we deal with all carcinogens, there is no safe amount, so the amount should ultimately be zero, and promulgated these standards.
So what's craziest about the situation to me is that this model or this approach to regulating chemical exposure, it makes sense in a lot of different contexts. So for pesticides, for example, which I'm more familiar with, they will do actual studies usually with rodents or some kind of an animal, and they will say, okay, here's the level where you actually see a biological effect, as you were just talking about, right? Here's the threshold where the animals, I don't know, maybe their sleep patterns change, or there's some detectable difference in their behavior or their physiology, whatever. And then they say, okay, well, here's the level above that where you actually see a harmful biological effect, right? So you establish all of these thresholds, and then you set the actual exposure that people are allowed 100 times or 1,000 times below that, depending on whatever the chemical in question is. And that makes sense, because you're saying, okay, here's where it causes harm. We're going to set it way below that. And then like with a pesticide or with a drug, you can still reasonably use it, or you can reasonably prescribe it or whatever, and nothing's going to happen. So when you do the right science, this approach makes sense. But when you just set these what seem like impossible standards, I mean, to the point that you can't even detect it, like you're sort of upending the system, right? You're not regulating at that point. You're just being so cautious to the point of absurdity. What do you think?
Yeah, it was true. It's out of an abundance of caution. I think Susan makes two other interesting points. The first point she makes is that I think we can all agree that cyanide is not a good thing to have in our diet. It kills you, right? Any two ways about it. And the enforceable amount of cyanide, what she calls the maximum contaminant level, is 0.2 parts per million, which, as she does after doing the math, is 50,000 times more than what standard that we're setting for these forever chemicals. So they must be really, really potent if they can do something to harm us at a dose of 50,000 times less than what cyanide can do. The other point that she makes is that all of our dietary is shown is that the predominant source of forever chemicals is in our food, not in our water. So that these standards are only going to push the needle, if they work completely well, by 20%. 80% of our forever chemicals comes from the things that we eat. So it's once again, I think, one of those times when we're going to have a regulation that sounds good to a lot of people, that is going to be difficult to enforce, and then we'll be hearing for years on end about how water facilities have not been able to comply with those standards, and we have to spend more money on getting there, and round and round and round, because we've come up with a regulation that is impractical to implement. And that's kind of the way it ties back to our first story.
Well, I always find it helpful to supply a little context and just point out that you are allowed to purchase all sorts of products that are quite harmful to you, that may or may not have reasonable uses, but nonetheless, they're widely available. So I'm sure this is true for you, Chuck. I can drive 5 minutes down the street from my house and I can buy enough alcohol to poison myself in a day, right? I could kill myself with the amount of vodka on the store shelf, right? And nobody blinks about that, really. Nobody cares because it's just widely accepted that you can consume alcohol in moderation. And if you choose not to do that, that's your problem. More or less is where things stand. But then with an issue like this, we absolutely obsess about, minuscule amounts of this or that chemical that most people have no idea what it does or why it's used or what it could possibly do to you. And it's just so backwards and confusing. I don't know how to make sense of that. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think you're right. I think we obsess about it because they're chemicals, and chemicals can't be good because they're not natural, as everybody knows. So that be part of the problem. And I think that there is a quality of our human nature, that Darwinian evolution part, where fear is a much better driver of things than happiness. If you find a plant and it tastes good, that's good. You'll be looking for another one. But if you find a plant and it makes you sick and you throw up, you're real careful to avoid that in the future. And I think it's that fear driving thing that makes it easier for the government to say, yeah, we're going to take care of this fear by doing this or that, even though it may not actually be. And the other thing is I did run across a very funny piece the other day talking about ice. And, back in the early 1800s, the source of ice was frozen lakes. And there was a very successful guy in Massachusetts who figured out that he could saw up the ice forming on the lakes and wrap it in straw and then sell it in the summer. And he made a small fortune selling ice into the Caribbean, because you can imagine having some ice to make a cold drink in the Caribbean year-round, let alone in July or in August, is quite a thing. And his company did quite well until the development of refrigeration. And they came out strongly against this artificial ice because it wasn't natural ice. It was processed ice. And I just thought that was such an amusing story to tell, because we all use artificial ice all day long. We never give it a thought that it's not natural ice.
Yeah.
With that vodka, you're going to be using artificial ice. So there you go.
Yeah, I don't know, man. There's just no way to make sense of it. Like, we're so selective, and not in a good way, about the risks that we worry about. And, this concern about natural versus synthetic, right? I'm going to type on my synthetic computer about the danger of all of these synthetic chemicals I'm exposed to. There's no end. All right. Well, I guess to try to end on a happy note, it's just awareness, right? Try to adjust your behavior in such a way that you're not letting the stuff drive you insane.
Exactly.
Because that's really all you can do, I think.
Well, I think it's like Cy Sims, another old person, said, an informed consumer is our best customer. If you understand what's going on, I think that makes it easier to navigate in the world. And I really hope that both of those articles contributed to understanding what was going on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, you guys just have a blessed week with this happy information at your disposal. We'll be back next week for episode 41. If you want to get the stories we talk about, you just go to acsh.org, scroll up top, click on subscribe, punch in your email address, and then 3 times a week we'll send you the stories that we publish. The ones you read the most are the ones that we talk about on the show. So with that, we're going to call it. Follow us on social media as well. It's at ACSH.org if you want to follow us and get all the content we publish. My personal is at CamJEnglish, and Chuck's on Twitter, but not really. So just follow the ACSH handle, and then that way you'll stay all informed. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.